Billionaire walks into restaurant and freezes when he sees his black pregnant ex-wife. She didn't see him walk in, not at first. But when she did, when her eyes locked on the man in the $1,000 suit, the tray in her hand rattled. The billionaire who once called her his forever was now staring at her 7-month belly, and he wasn't alone. A woman half her age leaned into him, laughing, her manicured fingers curled around his arm as though she'd owned it for years. Naomi Carter didn't feel shame in that moment. She felt rage. 3 years had passed since Maxwell Drake had stood in the doorway of their home, told her to pack her things, and handed her a single envelope of cash. $1,000 for 5 years of marriage. And the last thing he said before turning away? "You don't belong in my world." Tonight, he was sitting in hers. And what happened at table 17 would ignite a chain of events the city would talk about for years. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Naomi Carter had been working the late shift at Bella Vista for nearly 7 months now. The kind of place where every glass was polished to a mirror finish, and the prices on the menu could make a grown man's throat tighten. She was 29, 7 months pregnant, and carrying more weight on her shoulders than just the child she would soon bring into the world. Life had not been kind since Maxwell Drake, the man she had once called her husband, had closed the door on their marriage with the precision of a deal gone cold. Maxwell wasn't just wealthy. He was a billionaire real estate mogul whose name appeared in glossy magazines and whose presence could silence a room. That night, his arrival did more than silence Naomi. It stole her breath. And then there was the woman beside him, Sabrina Holt, elegant in a way that suggested she had never worked a day in her life, her movements deliberate, her smile polished for an audience. There was something in Maxwell's eyes when they met Naomi's, something between recognition and calculation. But was it guilt that held his gaze, or a deeper fear that someone else might notice it too? And why, of all the things that could have unsettled him, did the sight of Naomi's pregnancy seem to hit him like a blow? In that moment, the air between them felt charged, as if an invisible fuse had been lit. No one in that room could have known that what was about to happen at table 17 would not end with dinner. It would spiral into a series of events recorded in legal transcripts, dissected in newsrooms, and whispered about in corridors of power. By the end of this story, you'll understand why Maxwell Drake would give anything to erase that night from his life. Naomi Carter had never been a stranger to hard work. She was born in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia, where her mother kept the family afloat with 2 jobs and an iron will, and her father taught her that a person's worth wasn't measured in what they owned, but in how they carried themselves through hardship. Naomi was known for her resilience even as a teenager, holding down part-time work after school, taking care of younger cousins, and saving what little she could to help her mother keep the lights on. She wasn't chasing wealth. She was chasing stability, something she could never quite hold on to for long. That pursuit took an unexpected turn the night she met Maxwell Drake. It was at a charity gala she had been hired to help organize, a place where she felt more like an observer than a guest. Maxwell was the kind of man whose entrance could make people stop mid-conversation. He was tall, sharply dressed, with a voice that seemed to carry over the soft hum of the room. He asked her name as though it mattered, and that was the beginning. Their romance moved quickly. Dinners in Manhattan, weekends in the Hamptons whispered promises under city lights. Within a year, Naomi Carter became Naomi Drake. Life as Maxwell's wife was a world she'd never imagined. Penthouse apartments, designer gowns, private jets to places she'd only read about. But with that luxury came an ache she couldn't quite name. Maxwell's love was not without conditions. He was meticulous, opinionated, and quietly controlling. He chose her clothes for public events, corrected her speech in subtle but cutting ways, and reminded her, often, that she was lucky to be in his world. The cracks widened when Naomi began to notice how Maxwell's attention could vanish without warning, replaced by long business trips and unexplained absences. The day he ended their marriage was as cold as it was swift. He handed her a single envelope with $1,000 inside and told her the driver would wait while she packed her things. There was no fight, no explanation, just the unshakable message that she was no longer welcome. With nowhere to turn, Naomi took whatever work she could find, waiting tables, cleaning offices after hours, just to keep the rent paid. And then came the silent truth she carried alone. She was pregnant. She told no one. Not her family. Not her friends. The bills mounted, and the weight of her situation pressed harder with every passing month. And yet, amid the exhaustion, Naomi caught fragments of news about Maxwell, his company expanding aggressively, whispers about questionable land deals, rumors that not all of his fortune was built cleanly. She didn't pay much attention at first, but those murmurs would prove to be more than idle gossip. They would be the first shadows of a storm neither of them could escape. The Bella Vista was alive with the kind of quiet sophistication that Maxwell Drake had always demanded in his social circles. Soft candlelight, polished silver, the low hum of voices that never dared to rise above the music drifting from the piano in the corner. Naomi Carter had grown accustomed to that atmosphere, though now she was no longer a guest here. She was on the clock, wearing the crisp black and white uniform that marked her as part of the staff, weaving between tables with practiced efficiency. It was a busy night, and she had no reason to look toward the entrance, until a ripple of awareness seemed to pass through the room. She glanced up, and in that instant, her world narrowed. Maxwell Drake was standing just inside the doorway, pausing as the maitre d' approached him. His hand rested lightly on the back of a chair, while his gaze swept the room. Confident, assessing. Beside him, Sabrina Holt glowed with the kind of effortless beauty that came from a life untouched by worry. She leaned in close, saying something that made Maxwell's lips curve into a smile. Naomi's breath caught, but her eyes stayed fixed on him. He hadn't changed much. Still the same immaculate suit, the same watch that cost more than her yearly rent, the same air of ownership. But when his gaze landed on her, the easy smile faltered. For a fraction of a second, his expression froze, and in that silence Naomi could almost hear the calculations turning in his mind. She turned away, forcing her steps to remain steady as she carried a tray to another table. But the awareness of his presence burned at the back of her neck. Minutes later, she was assigned to table 17. As she approached, she could feel Maxwell's eyes following her every movement. Sabrina was in mid-laugh, but her attention flicked curiously between Naomi and Maxwell, sensing something unspoken. "Good evening," Naomi said, her tone polite, professional, but edged with something neither of them could quite place. "May I start you off with something to drink?" Maxwell's voice was smooth when he spoke, but the pause before his words betrayed him. "Water for now," he said, glancing at Sabrina as though trying to mask the weight of the moment. "And whatever the lady would like." Naomi's eyes lingered on him for just a second longer than necessary, her expression unreadable. She took their orders, but before turning to leave, she added softly, "It's been a while, Maxwell." Sabrina's brow lifted slightly, and Maxwell's fingers tightened around his menu. "Yes," he said evenly. "It has." She didn't look away. Some things change. Some don't. It was subtle, but deliberate, an opening move in a conversation that felt less like catching up and more like a chess match. Throughout the evening, Naomi returned to the table with quiet efficiency, yet each interaction carried an undercurrent that only she and Maxwell seemed to understand. She asked about his business in a way that sounded casual to anyone listening, but there was an edge in her voice, a suggestion that she knew more than she should. "Still working on those big land deals?" she asked at one point, her eyes never leaving his. "Must be hard keeping everything balanced." Maxwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Business is good," he said. "Very good." Naomi nodded, her tone mild. "I'm sure it is, though I hear the market's unpredictable these days." The silence that followed was brief, but heavy. Sabrina glanced between them again, her curiosity sharpening. Naomi could see the faintest shift in Maxwell's posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. She'd seen that look before, years ago, when he realized she had found something he'd wanted to keep hidden. It was then, as she cleared their plates, that she leaned in just slightly, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "I know you didn't come here tonight expecting to see me," she said, her tone calm but certain. "And I know you didn't expect me to be carrying your child." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending invisible ripples across the table. Maxwell's confident smile crumbled, his hand tightening around his glass. Sabrina blinked, a slow realization dawning in her eyes. Naomi straightened, her face composed, and carried the tray away, leaving Maxwell staring after her, the weight of her words settling over him like a shadow he couldn't escape. Maxwell Drake didn't finish his meal. 10 minutes after Naomi Carter's quiet but shattering words at table 17, he called for the check without touching the entree Sabrina Holt had only just begun to eat. He offered no explanation, no polite excuse. He simply stood, left a crisp stack of bills beneath the receipt, and placed his hand on Sabrina's back as they moved toward the door. But Naomi saw it. The stiffness in his shoulders, the way his jaw was locked tight, the way he avoided meeting her eyes as he passed. For all his wealth and polish, Maxwell Drake was retreating, and Naomi knew why. The restaurant seemed strangely quieter after he left, though the music played on and conversations continued. Naomi cleared the table, her movements calm, her mind anything but. She knew she had struck a nerve, but she didn't yet know how deep the wound went. That answer came sooner than expected. 2 nights later, as she stepped out of the employee entrance, a man was waiting by the alley wall. He introduced himself as Caleb Myers, an investigative reporter for one of the city's most read papers. He wasn't there for a quote about food service or the restaurant's menu. He was there for Maxwell Drake. Caleb told her in careful, deliberate words that Maxwell's real estate empire had been under quiet investigation for months. There were whispers of inflated valuations, fraudulent contracts, and land deals that had displaced entire neighborhoods. Caleb had sources who believed Maxwell wasn't just bending the rules, he was breaking them outright. Naomi listened without interrupting, her mind turning over pieces of her past with Maxwell that suddenly seemed sharper, more dangerous in hindsight. She thought of the phone calls he took behind closed doors, the tense trips that pulled him out of the country on short notice, the times he had warned her not to worry about things she didn't understand. Caleb asked her if she'd noticed anything during their marriage, documents, meetings, overheard conversations that might connect to the deals in question. She told him she had no interest in being part of any investigation. Caleb's voice softened, but his eyes didn't waver. "You might not have a choice," he said. "The kind of money Maxwell moves, people will protect it at any cost." That warning proved true in ways Naomi couldn't have predicted. Within a week, she found an envelope slipped under her apartment door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one line typed in the center. "Stay quiet. For your sake and the baby's." No signature, no return address. Just a plain, cold threat. Naomi's first instinct was fear, but it quickly hardened into something else. Resolve. She wouldn't be intimidated. Days later, another envelope arrived, this time hand-delivered by a man in a tailored suit she recognized from Maxwell's side during past social events. Inside was a cashier's check for $250,000. No note this time, but the message was clear: take the money and disappear. Naomi didn't cash it. She placed it in a shoebox at the back of her closet and began doing something she hadn't done in years: writing. Every night after work, Naomi opened a worn leather journal and began documenting everything she remembered. Dates, places, conversations, even snippets of overheard phone calls from her years with Maxwell. She wrote about the night she had walked into his study unannounced and seen a stack of unsigned deeds on his desk. The late-night arguments he'd had over speakerphone with associates whose voices she didn't recognize. The nervous way he'd reacted when certain names were mentioned. She wasn't writing for herself. She was building something, an account so detailed and undeniable that if anything happened to her, someone else could use it. But she didn't tell Caleb Myers about the journal. Not yet. Instead, she kept working, kept her head down, and waited. Because Naomi Carter understood something about Maxwell Drake that few others did. He was a man who thrived on control, and nothing frightened him more than a woman who knew enough to take it away from him. The first crack in Maxwell Drake's carefully polished armor came not from an investigator, not from a journalist, but from a single leaked medical record. Naomi Carter didn't know how it happened, whether someone at her clinic had been paid or pressured. But one morning she awoke to find Caleb Myers at her door, holding a folded manila envelope with her name scrawled across the front. Inside was a photocopy of her prenatal paperwork. Under Father, the line she had left blank in the official record now bore two typed words: Maxwell Drake. The truth was out, at least to someone willing to use it. Naomi stared at the paper for a long moment, her stomach twisting, not with shame, but with the heavy realization that the secret she had guarded for months was now a weapon someone else could aim. Caleb didn't press her for details. He didn't need to. The look on her face was enough to confirm what the document claimed. Naomi thought back to the nights after the divorce, the ones she never spoke about to anyone. Maxwell had called her out of the blue 3 months after casting her out, his voice softer than she remembered, carrying just enough contrition to make her hesitate before hanging up. He'd asked to see her, claiming there were things left unsaid, that he missed her, that he wasn't sleeping well. Against her better judgment, she met him. Not in public, but at the apartment he kept downtown. One meeting led to another. Old familiarity blurred with fresh anger until the nights became something dangerous and unspoken. She had known it wouldn't last, and it didn't. The call stopped. But by then, a different kind of connection had taken root. And now, that connection was undeniable. When Caleb's article broke 2 weeks later, it was less about her pregnancy and more about the larger story. Federal prosecutors had formally filed charges against Maxwell Drake for wire fraud, tax evasion, and racketeering tied to his real estate holdings. The headline was sharp enough to wound: Billionaire developer to face fraud trial, former wife among key witnesses. Naomi's name was in the piece, but there was another name she didn't expect to see: Sabrina Holt. The elegant woman from Table 17 wasn't Maxwell's new lover after all. She was his PR handler, hired to clean his public image as the investigation closed in. She had been with him that night at Bella Vista not for romance, but to prepare him for the inevitable: the cameras, the headlines, the trial. Naomi realized then that Sabrina's polite, watchful demeanor had been less about curiosity and more about calculation. The subpoena arrived 3 days later. Naomi was summoned to testify in federal court. The weight of it was immediate and crushing. She wasn't just a former wife now. She was a piece of the prosecution's case. Her journal, the one she'd been writing in for months, became her lifeline. Every date, every name, every suspicious meeting she'd recorded now had a place in the story the government wanted to tell. The day she stepped into the courtroom, Naomi felt the air change. Maxwell was already seated at the defense table, his suit perfect, his posture rigid. He didn't look at her as she walked past, but she saw the slight shift in his jaw, the muscle tightening like a man bracing for impact. The prosecutor began gently, establishing who she was, her marriage to Maxwell, the timeline of their life together. Then came the harder questions, about the study she wasn't allowed in, the late-night phone calls, the sudden cash withdrawals she'd discovered on bank statements. Naomi answered them all, her voice steady, her eyes never wavering from the attorney in front of her. When the defense had their turn, they tried to paint her as bitter, vengeful, financially desperate. They suggested she had reasons to lie. But Naomi didn't flinch. She told the truth in the same calm tone she'd used to take their orders at Table 17, recounting how Maxwell had come to her after the divorce, how those encounters had led to her pregnancy, how his fear that she might speak out had driven him to offer her hush money. By the time she stepped down from the witness stand, the room felt different. There was no applause, no overt reaction from the jury, but Naomi knew the shift was real. The man who had once told her she didn't belong in his world, now sat in that world's harshest light, his power reduced to the thin barrier of his legal team. For Naomi Carter, that was the first moment in years where she felt the balance of power tip in her favor. The courtroom was silent when Naomi Carter stepped down from the witness stand, but the silence carried weight. Maxwell Drake's attorneys conferred in low, urgent voices, their polished confidence thinning under the pressure of her testimony. Naomi took her seat behind the prosecution's table, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the judge. She had told the truth, not the version Maxwell had tried to buy, not the version his publicist Sabrina Holt would have crafted, but the unvarnished account of their life, their encounters after the divorce and the business dealings she had been told to ignore. What no one in the gallery yet realized was that Naomi had been working with federal investigators for months. That worn leather journal she kept hidden in her apartment was not simply a record of the past. It was the backbone of the case. Long before the night Maxwell walked into Bella Vista, Naomi had made the decision to protect herself and her unborn child by aligning with the people who had the power to bring him down. Every date, every location, every overheard phone call had been fed, piece by piece, to the prosecutors. She knew Maxwell well enough to understand that subtlety wouldn't shake him. He needed a shock, something so public and undeniable that he could not control the narrative. That was why, when she learned through whispered sources that Maxwell had reservations at Bella Vista with Sabrina Holt, she didn't swap shifts or call in sick. She made sure she was on the floor that night. The pregnancy wasn't a shield she hid behind. It was a truth she intended to wield. When the final week of the trial came, the evidence was no longer just numbers and contracts. It was personal. The jury saw the man behind the empire, the one who had manipulated, controlled, and silenced those who knew too much. On the morning of the verdict, Maxwell stood at the defense table, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the judge as 12 jurors filed in. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." The words landed with the weight of a closing cell door. Maxwell's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly, but to Naomi, it was the first honest movement she'd seen from him in years. The sentencing was swift. Maxwell Drake, once the untouchable mogul who decided who belonged in his world, was ordered to serve 22 years in federal prison. His assets were frozen, his empire dismantled. Sabrina Holt's role in shielding him came under its own scrutiny, though Naomi paid little attention to the fallout there. When Naomi walked out of the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter, sharper. The steps outside were lined with reporters calling her name, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. She didn't stop. One hand rested protectively over her belly as she moved through the crowd, her other clutching the strap of her bag. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence was enough. For the first time in years, Naomi Carter was free. Free from Maxwell's shadow, free from the rules of a world he had built to keep her small. In the end, Maxwell had been right about one thing. She didn't belong in his world. But he had been wrong about the reason. She didn't belong because she was far above it, standing on a ground he could never touch again. And as she stepped into the waiting car, she knew that the future she carried was hers alone to shape. Would you have confronted Maxwell Drake that night at Bella Vista? Or would you have turned away and let him walk out without a word? Would you have carried the weight of what you knew in silence, protecting yourself and your child from the danger that came with it? Or would you have taken the same path Naomi Carter chose, one that demanded patience, courage, and the willingness to face him not just in public, but in a courtroom where the truth would strip away everything he had built? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone, and your perspective matters. And if you think this story was shocking, wait until you hear what happened when a millionaire widow vanished just hours before her wedding, leaving behind a single note that changed everything investigators thought they knew. That story is coming soon, and you won't want to miss it. So make sure you're subscribed, with notifications turned on, so you're the first to hear it. Your next story is only moments away.